So at the core, we're complex movements, and complex movements, the word complex comes from our collective belief that complexity science gives us a new way to think about how change happens in the world. It moves from this idea of critical mass to critical connections.
Hello, friends. My name is Gibrán Rivera. I'm a facilitator, and this is my podcast. Here, I am inviting you into a conversation with remarkable leaders who are devoting their lives to the evolution of consciousness and culture. In this episode, I'm introducing you to my friend Sage Crump. Sage is an artist with the Complex Movements Artist Collective. She's a facilitator, a wisdom holder, a brilliant theory head, and she's the new chief architect of the Emergent Strategy Ideation Institute. This is a fun, beautiful, stimulating, wide-ranging conversation, and I can't wait for you to get to know her. Thank you for listening. Sage, it's so good to see your face and to have you here in the podcast. Thank you for saying yes. I can't wait to catch up with you.
Me too. I have been following the podcast, and when the invitation came, I was like, yes. I always enjoy the time we have when we talk together, and it's too far and few between, and so this feels very precious to me.
I am so
I'm
grateful
grateful.
too. And as I mentioned to you in a note, I'm experimenting with a different kind of beginning, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. So the question I'm going to ask you, and I'll tell you why I'm asking that question, is can you share a belief that you once held closely that you might no longer think is true, or you have kind of changed your relationship to it? And the reason why I'm asking this is because as I witness polarization in the country, it seems like people are really calcifying on positions on right and wrong, on either side, right? Whether it be the right or the left, it seems like people are getting really, really rigid about their beliefs. I refer to it as fundamentalism. And I felt, well, what would happen if I start the question, if I kind of emphasize on the podcast more often that we grow by changing our minds? And I'll give you just as an example for you and for our listeners. I grew up a Puerto Rican nationalist. It was a central part of my identity. Anybody that met me knew I was a nationalist. My father was a nationalist, and I just embraced it. And it was kind of the lens through which I saw everything. I was like Puerto Rican first, you know? And over the years, as I started to question nationalism itself, or the role of countries and borders, right? And seeing that nationalism actually tends to be a right-wing ideology, you know? I started to let go of that belief, but it's really amazing to me to look at it right now and not feel any sense of nationalism. I mean, I'm still proud of my culture, but I don't hold that kind of political nationalism. And it feels so freeing to not have to have that lens on everything. It was like everything that was Puerto Rican had to be good by virtue of being Puerto Rican. And anything that wasn't was just a little less good, you know?
Yeah.
And you really bind yourself by these ideologies. And I just wanted to like open the first volley by sharing one of my beliefs. And so I was curious as to what one of those might be for you. And of course, we'll back our way into your story and your work. But I thought we'd start right there with a change of mind and heart.
Yeah, I love this question. It's one of the reasons I have some of the elders and some of the people I follow is because they were folks who held very strong ideas, but were able to change over time and grow and be informed by what's around them and how they changed. And so for me, the first thing that came to my mind was this notion of Black excellence. I grew up in a, half as far, twice as hard kind of, place. And this idea that I had to personally be excellent. But excellent was always an external I, right? I always had to look excellent to someone else. It was this idea that like you had to, in order to represent the race, in order to represent Black people, like to be in spaces, I was always trained to think about how folks would look at me and make decisions about Black people. And holding on to that required an incredible amount of pressure, right? Like an incredible amount of like externalization of my own value. And I don't believe it anymore. Not that I don't believe in excellence, not that I don't believe there are things that are Black people that are doing that are excellent, but as a personal um, directional, it no longer served me. It no longer serves me, because it doesn't allow for my full humanity. It doesn't. It does. It means I can't possibly call and ask for an extension on a deadline that was going to require me to work till 3 a.m. for the next 3 days. Right? Like you just. Oh no! Like you can't do that. Where now I'm like, you know, deadlines are suggestion, if you ask me. Like I don't. I'm going to do my best. But if I have to call someone, I have to call someone. Because I am equally as interested in being considered someone of value to others as I am to caring for myself, and making sure that I am able to walk through the world with a level of health and self possession and self determination. And so I have, much to my poor mother's chagrin, laid aside the idea of needing to perform Black excellence for others.
That is a very powerful one. I appreciate you saying it. I'm sure it resonates with a lot of our listeners, right? It's like I think achiever types, A-type personalities, already have this drive, but when you're a person of color, there's all kinds of layers on top of it, right? And so I think there's something really liberating in what you're saying. Thank you for being
Absolutely.
generous.
Like I said, I think it's an amazing question. I think a lot about how do we get outside of binaries, and when you lock yourself into an ideology, then it limits your possibility, what you actually see as possibility in the world. And I'm interested in, like, how do we become more generative? How do we see more? How do we put ourselves in ways that are surprising even to ourselves?
That's right. That's right. That's really powerful. Well, I want to say two things. I want to comment on that, but I first want to say what's interesting is that people that don't know you, haven't been in your presence, you exude excellence, right? Like, you exude a sense of pride. Like you inhabit your body, and there's a way in which a kind of strength and radiance comes out of you that is really powerful. And what I like about it, given what you just said, is that it's so authentic. It's obviously not performed. It's almost like by tapping the inner part of it, right? You actually can embody the goal more than if you were trying to play to somebody else's tune. So I just wanted to reflect that back to you, that when I'm around you, you give off that sense of strength and excellence. It's really palpable.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I'm trying to remember the name of the Silicon. I said it's a sage of Silicon Valley. I'll look it up and put it in the show notes. I'm forgetting right now. But he wrote an essay that became popular about the importance of keeping your identity small. Precisely because of what you just said. The more you bind yourself to an identity, right, or to an ideology of what your identity is and should be, the more you close up possibilities. I think, of course, it's very different for a millionaire, billionaire, white Silicon Valley guy to say that than somebody whose identity can put them under threat. I think there should be more sophistication to what he's saying, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't hold an important truth, and it's part of what I heard in what you were just explaining.
I think there's a yes and to that, right? Like there's like my identity as a Black woman, like as a Black person, like is very central, and yet what I get to do by releasing an external look is be able to dive more deeply into all of the things that could actually mean, right? Like when you release someone else's definition of your identity, then you can use like, I'm really interested in how we take words, and instead of like being like, that's not the right word, let me find another, we take it and we expand it, right? And so, how do we make it as large or continue to make it larger and larger and larger and larger, of all the things that can fall underneath this particular word or identity? So, like I feel Sage of Silicon Valley in like this. There is a way in which identity can make us smaller, right? Like when we are living inside someone else's picture of it. But what I do is I love to play inside my all of my identities as a Black woman, as a queer woman, as a person who's dedicated to art and culture in the South, and like all these things. Layer up to make really good stew, right? Like, and you can take a potato, an onion, and some garlic, and you can make a soup. You can make potato latkes. You can make mashed potatoes. You can make, like you can make all these things with the same few pieces. And I'm excited about that. That gets me excited.
I like it. I like this too metaphor quite a bit. Sage, I wanted to start with that question. And then I want to just give you an opportunity to tell us how you describe yourself, how you define yourself nowadays. I think of you as a cultural strategist. I think of you as an artist. I think of you as a thought leader. What role? What are the roles that you are practicing lately?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question because I have a good friend who's a filmmaker, and she has a 3-word bio. And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting. If I were to try and figure out like what is my 3-word bio?" And so I've gotten it down to 5 is what I'm doing now. And so my 5-word bio right now is philosopher, strategist, movement worker, 2 words, and maker.
Nice.
Um, and I feel like everything I do and how I move through the world embodies not only all of those individually, but and the ways in which they intersect. Because oftentimes, um, theoreticians or philosophers are not considered makers or strategists, right? They're considered like 2 different camps. In my mind, they have to be connected, and I shouldn't for anyone else. I'm say for me, they are connected. They are deeply interconnected. I am excited about imagining and then making, and seeing what happens after that, right? And watching its flow in the world. With a particular lens, which is why I include movement worker, because I'm the transformation of the world in which we live in towards justice, dignity, and honor for all of us feels really essential to everything for me. And so this 5-word bio, philosopher, which was really the first one I was like, ooh, can I call myself a philosopher? Is that allowed? And I decided it is. It is. I think a lot. I'm a double Aquarian. I think a lot. And um, I have theories and ideas about damn near everything, and then as a cultural strategist, that has been my work, but I've come to just name it as an integral part of how I believe change happens. Like it is the core of my theory of change to the transformation of this world, is around art and culture. Uh, and then a movement worker, because I don't believe we do anything by ourselves. We're never alone. I think we're always interconnected, um, at all times. And so I don't think about that as an individual moment. Like I'm a movement worker, which means I am connected not just to other other folks who are intentional about transforming the world, but that I'm connected to an ancestral lineage of folks who have looked at what was in front of them and said there can be something different, and I have some ideas on how to make it different, and I'm going to try and make that happen. And then I'm a maker, which includes my art, complex movements. I have a collective with my partner called the Kinfolk Effect, my own personal artistic practice, writing, and really, I feel like satisfaction is a small word. Like I know when I am on purpose, when I watch the seed crack the ground. I'm like, Yes. Okay, like I'm interested in the planting of it, but when the first shoot cracks the ground, that is the most uh, um, intense, beautiful spiritual moment
Beautiful.
for me.
Thank you. What a
Yeah.
thoughtful response. I'm appreciating it. I want to ask you a question, but then I'm going to make a comment. And the question is, of all of these things that you're focused on, I want our listeners and myself to hear, what's the project, what's the effort, what is the thing that you are working on right now that is turning you on, that is capturing your imagination. And the comment I wanted to make as you think about that is when you talk about philosopher and maker and the connection there, I know that one of the places in which you and I intersect is in our study and our work with complexity, right? And it seems to me that as we move into ever increasing complexity, the only way to say anything about it is by poking at it, right? Is by like having your hands in it. You do
Hmm.
something, it responds, you learn something, you iterate. It seems
Yes.
harder and harder to kind of abstract the whole thing out, absent some kind of practice, absent some kind of engaged doing. So it doesn't surprise me that you would land there. But I am curious as to what it is that is exciting you, turning you on right
Wow. That's like a thing. It's
now.
hard, partly because I have come to accept and learn that my mind works in systems, so everything feels so interconnected to me. It's that it makes me really excited. I think the so my practice as a maker, as an artist. Outside of a writing practice, I've been a poet for a very long time, but I've recently moved into a visual arts kind of installation with my hands, making type of practice. And I'm doing that both with Complex Movements, the Artist Collective, here in New Orleans, here in New Orleans with the Kinfolk Effect, with Muti Reed, and um, also with Kayi Barrows and Black Surrealism. And the I have spent so much of my adult life because of this complexity, right? I think a lot about networks and interconnectedness. And so it's been a lot about people and their individual bodies and like who needs to meet whom where and how that sparks something different and how this person's work connects with this other person's work and how can we all speak a language that makes sense to all of us so we can see how our work interconnects and scales up to a larger sense. But this practice of making things is new and it has got me really excited because what I have come to understand through it is how that then shifts how working with my hands shifts what I see and think. And so I was working on this project and working on this project with a great artist named Wes Taylor about the transformation spiral, and it was a theory I'm playing with about how change happens and a time spiral and all this, and and so I was doing some writing on it, and I was stuck. And Wes, who's a graphic artist and a design thinker, was like, "Let's make some collages of spirals." And I was like, "Okay, all right." I'm not, And once started making them, and then I would look at the spiral, I had a whole new, fresh writing for the whole idea of transformation. Like every time I made a new collage, a new spiral, all types of new words, understandings of how we are impacted by our relationship to time and context, and iteration gave itself a new layer. And so I think one of the things that if I had to like land on I don't know if it's a project, but a practice that right now I am really excited about that's really turning me on. It's making things with my hands that is informing um, what I see in the world and my theories and philosophies are intimately connected to the process of physically making something. And it's a revelation.
That's
It's
beautiful.
yeah.
It resonates very deeply for me as somebody that certainly doesn't make enough with my hands. But there's other projects that engage my hands, like our community garden,
Yes.
right? Which is not the same as making, but there is something about that engagement, or cooking even, right?
Mhm.
Excuse me. It makes me aware that that there's a kind of different intelligence that becomes available. So what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me.
Mhm.
I I grew up Catholic, and part of that process included like looking at the split between Catholicism and
Hmm.
Protestantism, and and I now even now having a very different kind of spiritual perspective. I do think about kind of German Protestantism and it how it got rid of
Mm.
statues and incense and standing up and kneeling down. And there was a lot of ritual that you did with your body and that impacted your senses. And the idea was to like get rid of this church as mediator, right?
Mhm.
But then it was kind of reduced to yourself and the book, like what you read, right, and what
Yeah.
you understood with your mind. And I do feel like something gets lost there, right? It starts to bias the culture towards understanding with your head,
Yeah.
as opposed to like understanding with your body and your other senses. And for some reason, that link came up for me, just because I know that you are a very sharp thinker, right?
Yeah.
So to hear that you're also now engaging your making and your hands seems very resonant with a similar process
Mhm.
for me.
In fact, I could have answered your first question about what did you hold deeply that you've shifted with the same with this, I shift, I'm I take a lot of heart and instruction from the life of Grace Lee Boggs, who lived to be 100 years and 100 days and was a lifelong learner. And like this idea of like constantly learning also to me is about like how we personally shift as we learn and having spent and deeply valued like I said, I'm a double Aquarian. I think a lot. Like thinking is important. I have a lot of thoughts. I read a lot of theory. Some folks are like, "Ew, how can you?" For me, it's really exciting, and often like it's like, "Oh, it's the spark that sends me off on something else." Um, and a couple of years ago, I took my first course in generative somatics and was like, I'll say between generative somatics and just a history of ritual, of drumming, dance, like the thing, that these things around our bodies, I think you're hitting on something really um, important for the next iteration of humanity. And it's about like how our bodies are tuned, how we are physically tuned, how we are, and by tuned, I don't mean around like health kinds of things. I mean, like a tuning fork to all the information that's around us at all times. All the things that our bodies are telling us that for so many reasons, we don't think about or our minds are holding kind of separate from us for sometimes really good reasons around well, actually I think always the reasons. I won't get into good or bad. There are always reasons why we don't acknowledge things at particular times, but that our bodies will tell us when we're ready to listen. And I think this idea of the removal of the kneeling, having been to couple of Catholic weddings, and like particularly, I'm like, ooh, oh, I should have worn a different dress. I didn't know. um, this idea of our bodies being a part of how we understand the world um, feels really exciting to me right now.
Yeah, I think we are totally
Mhm.
aligned there. Um,
Hmm.
for sure, it's definitely a wisdom and an understanding that merits more of our attention. There's a lot there. There's there's yeah, it brings us back to earth in so many
Hmm.
ways.
And you hear
Um,
like little drips and drabs of it, like the institution of walking meetings. Everyone's like, "Yo, you should do walking meetings." I don't know anyone who actually does it necessarily, but I, but there was a lot of like talk about it a few years ago. I don't know.
yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and it's interesting because the biggest complication with a walking meeting is who is taking the notes, right? And but it seems to kind of fetishize the 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 writing of the thing rather than the process itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I said have a walking meeting, come back and take a couple of minutes to write down the essence of it, right? Like, that's it. That's it. Um, Tell me a little bit about your work with complex movements, and especially I bring it up because I've been familiar with your that work and your work for a while, as from early conception, but also because I want to know what does it mean to be an artist in residence at the Haas Institute. Like, tell us about what complex movements is, and what does this mean for you all?
Sure. So Complex Movements is a 5-member artist collective. Um, we say based out of Detroit. I joke my mother's from Detroit. That's why they let me hang out with them. That includes myself, graphic artist Wesley Taylor, performer, sound engineer Carlos Garcia, music producer and filmmaker Wajid, and community organizer, lyricist Il Weaver Invincible. And the 5 of us have been working together over the last, like 6 or 7 years now, as a collective to build performance installations that support local organizing. So at the core, we're complex movements, and complex movements, the word complex comes from our collective belief that complexity science gives us a new way to think about how change happens in the world. It moves from this idea of critical mass to critical connections. So at the core of all of our work is like, how are we supporting connections being made locally, translocally, person to person, individually? What are the cultural practices that help do that? And we do that through right now, large scale immersive environments. A lot of our work is based on the work of Grace Lee Boggs, who I mentioned a little earlier, um, and other folks who um, started thinking about, in the midst of movement, having had like long community organizing practices, started thinking about there are different ways we could be making change, right? Like there are other ways, and that sometimes the way that we think, the way we've been told change happens, is actually a part of what is trying to keep us further from the change that could actually turn the tide, right? And so um, all of the so that's the core of complex movements. And you say we're going to change the way people think about making change by creating immersive artistic experiences that help create new strategies for local organizing. And when we say new strategies, those aren't always campaigns against the government, but really at the core of what I think about culture is like how we be together. Like, how are we being together, and like how do we look and understand each other and the people around us as resources and sources. As my friend Kim Peavy would say, she's like, there's resources, that's great, but we want to get to the source, and the source is like our soul space. How are we connecting in our humanity and dignity? And so complex movements, we have toured. We had a work called Beware of the Dandelions, which was beautiful multimedia experience that folks went into a pod and experienced projections and music, live performance. In addition to that, that body of work has a set of movement memory maps, which are stories told by people in their own communities of how they've tried to create change. We do a lot of workshop series. Part of one of the things that I want to just highlight is in the midst of that work and in the midst of all of our work, one of the things we're really interested in is what happens inside community. So when we talk about like strategies and things like that, we're not always talking about like we're trying to change a government or a policy campaign or things like, when you think of cultural community organizing, sometimes those feel like that's the immediately place your mind goes. But thinking about what happens while we're trying to, like, when do we need to be able to hold, and how do we hold each other accountable, right? What does love actually have to do with movement work, and how is that practiced, right? How do we pull? What is ancestral memory, and how do we pull on it to think about what's the next step we want to take? And so the Haas Institute is a really interesting residency for us because it at its core it's around belonging. And like the juxtaposition of othering and belonging, and we're working on this text called Tower and Dungeon, which is about how space is designed by architects to either that spatial justice, how space can encourage belonging or actually encourage a sense of othering and make people not want to be a part of it. And it's based on a book by a woman named Gloria House called Tower and Dungeon. And the same architects who built this Tower of Industry also built a prison and thought very intentionally about how both of those spaces were designed to make folks feel small who didn't belong, to make them feel unwanted. They're not logical, like doorways that lead nowhere. Like it's crazy that this was their intention. And so we're using that text to say, like, if someone can be so intentional about designing a space and a physical movement experience to make sure that someone doesn't feel grounded, to make sure that someone never has a sense of uh, um, connection. What does it look like to build space that does the opposite, that makes you feel more connected, that makes you feel a sense of groundedness? Um, and so that's sort of how we got to the Haas Institute, and why residency there is going to be really exciting. We're interested in that space for us.
I appreciated you're talking about belonging because one of the points, so let me take a couple of steps back. I am working with a friend on we call it creating a space that is safe from safe spaces. And the reason for that is because there's something around all the kind of tropes of wokeness, the kind of fragility, the way we center victimhood, that feels like it's like limiting what we can do together. And you and I had a conversation, an informal conversation about this. So every time I talk with her, her name is Tuesday, Tuesday Ryan, her facilitator that I work with closely. You come to mind as somebody that I'm going to call when we finally figure out a way to gather people around this conversation, because you and I had a conversation around this. And the reason why it comes up now in the context of belonging and othering is because one of the things that, one of my observations is that we have a crisis of connection in the culture, right? And that everyone is impacted by it, including including movement people. And so a way in which we signal that we're part of the tribe, right, is by shooting out these flares that say, "Hey, I'm in, I belong," right? And there's all kinds of codes like capitalism or white supremacy or cis heteropatriarchy. Like there's all of these words that they matter. I'm not saying that the words and the critiques don't matter, but a lot of times when I hear them come into a space, it feels a lot like people are throwing flares up, and it feels like it's something that helps us know that we belong to the same tribe, but it also signals the possibility of exile, right? And even a fear of exile, right? So we do this like policing of each other as a way to keep the tribe together, but it feels to me like a brittle kind of belonging, right? Like we know we are in this, but exile is always around the corner, and so like everybody's afraid of saying the wrong thing, right? And so people then want to toe the line ever more fiercely so that they definitely uh, don't get kicked out. So it's almost like I'd rather be the person that kicks somebody out than get myself kicked out, right? And so there's a way in which it meets the need for belonging, um, but it's kind of brittle in that way. And I'm curious, as somebody that is looking at culture, looking at how do you practice love, looking at how you bring in ancestral wisdom, looking at how we are with each other. I'm looking as to how you grapple with that tendency in our spaces.
Yeah. So I've been actually talking about this a lot in the last couple of weeks because one of the things that um, has happened in the culture in which we currently live, which is very different than uh, when I say ancestral, I mean like ancestral, like indigenous, like history or spaces, is we don't have strong practices or rituals, more specifically, around repair, right? And because we don't, there's this brittleness that you're feeling to me is because you're either opt in or you opt out, and there isn't enough uh, um, there isn't enough space made for the in between of in or out. These binaries are so damaging um, that it's not a question of out. It's just a question of how to stay in, right? Like what needs to happen. And so like I said, I've been talking about this a lot with organizations that are trying to do racial justice inside them, and like when the only people who talking are people of color because the white people don't want to say anything because they might say the wrong thing, and like there I agree there is no safe space. What we need to do is figure out how to make spaces where folks can be brave, and then how do we collectively care for each other on the backside of that. This idea that anybody, particularly in movement spaces, it bothers me because we're fighting against disposability yet treating each other like we're disposable, and we're not. And as soon as we like single, like nobody it gets thrown out, right? Like that's not uh, um, uh, uh, a possibility. We can create more room for where and how, right? And what support. And I say that knowing full well that there are um, horrendous things that happen in the world, right? There's a quote I came across the other day that said, the goal of humanity is to not have any illusions, but not be disillusioned. And so I have no illusions that there are not people who are out here in the world intentionally causing great harm, and uh, and still I have to center on something, which is nobody is disposable. And so when things happen, when someone says the wrong thing, or when um, uh, uh, um, there has to be a system, either personally or collectively, and I advocate for more collectively because that's where I think we're missing it, to get us back in right relationship. Um, uh, Not just I'm not messing with you anymore. Although that is a thing, right? Like there's also this, like, there are boundaries to be had. But the question is like, well, there's another, I do a lot of quotes because I love them. I think it's really great. It's like, boundaries are the way I can love you and myself simultaneously. And so I'm not saying you don't create boundaries or you let people just do whatever they want. But there was a time when there were rituals and practices, when we went through rites of passages, when we had very specialized gatherings. We had specialized drum rhythms. I mean, we had everything was like tailored to like what do we need to be in right relationship with each other and the land, and our ancestors and all. And I think that's when I think about what you're talking about when I see it, it's a reminder to me that we are still trying to figure out how to build towards more humanity inside movement spaces with each other, as much as we're trying to claim our dignity and humanity from oppressive systems, that don't see us. We still need to build our lens inside movement spaces to be able to see each other if we're going to get to what we believe is the world we want to live in.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that care and for that wisdom. It resonates deeply. It certainly, yeah, it really does. I have been um, personally responsible for hurting others in our context, right? And I have needed uh, to be restored, right? And I wish we had uh, those rituals in place. Um, and yeah, I do think it has to do with not having a coherent enough shared story that kind of holds us together. It and gives us a sense of belonging to ourselves and to each other and to something that started before us and that will go on after us.
And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier, also around, and we'll bring back Sage from Silicon Valley. Like this idea of this, there are moments where your identity, this is where the smallness of identity can be really valuable, right? Where you're sort of pulling back all of the layers of what makes us different, and not to discard them, but also to set our lenses for our collectivity, for our similarity, for our likeness, not to homogenize us, but to find and name and practice that connection that we really have.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that. I'm curious. You've talked about ancestral practices. You talked about drum beats and embodiment. You've talked about generative somatics. I'm wondering what you can share about your own practices, your own ways to connect to spirit and to ancestors and to yourself, and how do you cultivate this lovely and powerful energy that you hold?
Yeah. I there's a song that says, what is it? You can't tell me. Oh, darn it. I can't think of it. But it's just about the people around you. It's something like, I have the best click, right? Like it's about like the people that you're around. And so I've been really, really, um, uh, lucky is the word I'm going to use right now, but it feels so small. To early in my 20s have met elders, to have been able to participate in ritual and spiritual ritual from different places from around the world. I spent a time working with an organization called the Spirit of Truth Foundation that gathered indigenous elders from around the world whose family lineages had been broken. Like no one in their family was going to carry on their traditions, and so we would gather in the mountains of Georgia for 2 weeks every year with elders from all over the world, because there were young people that they wanted to pass this on to, because they didn't have their family, their direct bloodline, but they didn't want traditions and things to disappear. And so I've spent at the foot uh, of folks who have, to be considered an elder in this, you had to have an established like 300-year generational experience of spiritual teachings. And so having been there and sat at the foot of shamans and sangomas, priests and priestesses in a wide range of traditions, which is also a part of my framework, because I've never really settled into any particular. So I've been it also tuned my lens to the commonalities of so many things, of spiritual practice and culture. Um, that was just formative. In fact, it was formative. And then after being with the Spirit of Truth Foundation for a while, I wound up singing in a gospel group, and with an amazing group of folks. The group's called Voices of Light, and they'd be like, "All right, Sage is going on the weekend for one of her, some sort of treatment." And then, I'd come back and we'd, go sing at a Mother's Day at a Baptist church in, Mississippi, and so it was, it was so all these practices, I got to experience them in so many different ways, and have learned just really clearly. I mean, at the core of what I believe is that what we cannot see is more powerful than what we can see. That's just a core belief of mine, period. Um, and so I'll say, in addition to that, is that we all have access to more than we know. And actually, the knowing is what some ways sometimes gets in the way of what we have access to. And have been in a practice of connecting to different ways of knowing, personally supporting other people in hearing and knowing information that is not in books, that comes through your body, that comes through you. Um, and that has taken on many forms. It sings, songs. And back to this idea of, like, how do we tune this vessel that we have? I feel like song is such a really uh, instrumental tool in tuning these vessels that we walk in. Song, sound. That's what drums, rhythms. I also have a tarot practice that has stayed with me for many years, and having spent at one point, I was in a spiritual school, for lack of a better term, and having we were in ritual twice a week, every week for 4 years. And so this sort of it's and I tell folks, like, it's a muscle that we all have. Like, we all have access to whether you want to call it the Akashic records, like, you can call it all kinds of things. Like, we all have access to these things. It's just about having spent time um, with folks who were able to support, and also growing that muscle for myself and believing that it exists.
That's beautiful. That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that generous answer. Amazing, the breadth of practice. It's perceptible in you. It really is. I appreciate it so much when I'm in your company, and right now. Part of what came to mind as you were talking about sound, I have for a good period of time engaged in a practice of literally chanting, and so and recently I saw a little clip that talked about the people of Rwanda. So when the West sent help to the people of Rwanda after genocide, they sent some therapists, and the Rwandans were like, well, it's kind of weird, It's like one-on-one, 50 minutes in a room, a sterile room. It doesn't seem to be working. What they needed, right, was to sing together and dance together and listen to the drum together to heal from very, very, very serious trauma, right? I wish we would give that more of a chance in our own healing. Nothing against therapy, particularly if you've been brought up and conditioned in a Western system. I think it's a powerful, powerful approach. I go to it myself. But this thing that you and I keep pointing back to, the sound, the singing, the drumming, the dancing, the body, as medicine, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you know, but my first career was as a therapist.
Is that right?
Like for clinical psychology, my advanced degrees in clinical psychology. I worked for 10 years with people, serious persistent mental illness and HIV, which is when I tell the story of how I got politicized, it was actually through that process. I'm working with patients, working with people. Um, and part of what I really came to understand, both as my spiritual walk grew, I couldn't stay in that work in the same way, but also it's so individual, right? Like, and just from a like a political analysis, like how I think change happens in the world, therapy is working on you as an individual, but then you have all these systems and things that you're interacting with. And I would see people try so hard, um, and not be able to navigate what was happening around them. But we weren't actually trying to do anything about what was around them, right? Like, so when I think about like things that are there's so many things that I was taught in school, working in it as a therapist, that were diagnosable that I understand differently now. That I could, some folks might have a checklist for me, and I think I'm fine, right? you know, but it's the ways in which Western medicine has decided, what is acceptable and what isn't, and we don't have a culture anymore that supports folks and their various abilities, not disabilities, but their various abilities, to be integrated into community. Right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's so powerful. I think this is the place where you and I meet is the paradigm that we are moving away from, that is still dominant, that has shaped our world, that is changing pretty fast. Is mechanistic, it's Newtonian, it atomizes things, right? It's reductionist, and so when we look at complexity, when we look at networks, when we look at systems, what we're looking at is the way everything is interconnected. It's an entirely other lens than kind of trying to reduce everything to like, okay, what pill can I give this one person so that they feel better in a system that is not in any way designed for their happiness or their well-being. It's a very interesting thing. It's how you end up with the most affluent nations on earth also being the most depressed and the most medicated, right, and the most anxious, and it's it's telling that this is what we're yielding.
Yeah. And I'm appreciating the reference to complexity, because some folks think I talk about it too much. I don't think it's possible. So I'm loving talking with someone who brings it up as much as I do, because I think that's also even in our conversation about what happens inside movement spaces about in or out or kicking people in or out, like that is because that's because we're trying to reduce what's happening in the space to something that we think is manageable, or a sense of sameness. And when we flip that and lean into complexity, then those moments of tension or those moments of difference are actually some of the most valuable moments in a space. And how do we lean into that and not try and like excise it, right? Like, and not try to excise people that we may be aligned with but have disagreements around. Like, how do we actually work through that and create something new that didn't exist before that? Like, how does that I have an elder, Audrey Scott Williams, who talks about the point of radical tension, and like when a baby bird is trying to get through the shell, like that the beak on the shell hurts, like it's a point of tension, and that is what cracks open the next, right? Like, and so how do we look at these moments not as like problems, but through the lens of complexity of like, this is actually part of iteration and is going to crack us open to what's next.
That's right. I mean, this is what I like a lot about Adrienne's distinction. I don't know if it's hers, but she's the one I learned it from.
Mm-hmm.
Between restorative and transformative, right? To restorative justice, right, being to restore, to bring things back into balance. But transformative being, how do things become better than they were
Yeah.
before the harm was caused? And I think it's something very deeply resonant
Hmm.
uh, for me to think about it in that
Yeah.
way. We're coming up on our time, and I wanted to. There's a couple of questions that I like to ask
Please.
my guests, and of course, give you any opportunity to drop any further pearls of wisdom.
Hmm.
Tell us where to find you, that kind of thing. Uh, the first one is connected to this conversation about transformative justice and harm cause and all of these things. Uh, I have made this commitment to myself that when I'm talking to powerful women such as yourself, uh, in this post Me Too moment, as I work with men, as I gather men to find ways for us to atone for what we've done, to become better, to restore and transform um, the way in which we show up in the world. The question that I have for you in this patriarchal system is, what did you say to men? What do you think men should do
Mm.
uh, to become better?
Oh. Um, One of the things that I am aware of oftentimes with men is their level of fear and the lengths they will do to cover that up. You know, um, and I think that what um, is a total reframing available? Like, is that an option on the table? Right?
Totally,
Because I think
bring it, bring it.
there's a
Sorry.
total reframing around strength, around value that needs to happen in the world in general. And I think part of that is being held very strongly by men. That this perception of any type of emotion or vulnerability is problematic, is a weakness, um, is part of why the world looks like is a good part of why the world looks like it does, right? So like I really want men to sit in a room a bunch of and just cry together. I want that sort of like I don't want to see it, I don't need to see it, but I think there's like this practice of like how to know in your own body the sense of strength a great weeping can give you, right? Like I want, and yeah, like it may seem, I don't, it doesn't seem counterintuitive because of how I frame, but I think that similarly, like similar to what you shared with me earlier about like what are you experiencing, like how to understand like really what it means to be in touch with yourself that doesn't involve your hands or fingers, right? Like, what does it mean to find that and have that space? And part of that is to back to this idea of like radical tension, break open. Like you gotta crack that. Um, that the shell to actually see what's inside that is ready to take flight. And so I want, so yeah, that's kind of where I'm landing. I'm laughing at myself, but and I'm like, is there something more profound? But I absolutely think that what I'm saying is true. I want groups of men all around the world weeping together.
That's so beautiful. That I can't. I don't know that there's much more profound than that. I think you're right on. I think that really resonates deeply. Thank you for saying it and saying it so beautifully and with so much compassion, so much kind of care in your heart for it. I agree. I definitely agree, and I'm committed to that process for sure. Thank you for
Oh,
that.
thank you.
Um, the,
This The more that you do, the less I have to do. Hey.
That's what we're working on. That's what we're working on. Taking responsibility ourselves, for sure, for sure. So the other question is required. It's a little bit of a time travel question.
Ooh,
The light touch facilitation. So
I
it
love time
requires
travel.
you so if I could invite you, right, to leap into the future, to do 20 years into the future, a generation in, and consider that you have continued to say yes, that much of what you're working on within yourself and in the world has come into fruition. And of course, some things haven't and some struggles continue. But that you've grown, that you've evolved, that you've learned, that you've contributed even more. And you don't have to describe that future to me. You just have to see it for yourself. And if you took a moment to see it, and then in that shape and that form of the future, come back here to us. What would you say? What would you say to yourself? And what would you say to us from that perspective?
I wouldn't say anything. I would be singing. I would just sing. Like I'm almost stuck now because I'm like, what do I want to sing? Like I just want to, like I just,
Aha.
it's it isn't words. Like it's the resonance of the in both of my body and the idea of the way sound travels and like never hits anything and is both inside this vessel and moves and our interstellar friends are hearing it. Like it's yeah, I would be singing.
That's so beautiful.
Mm.
That is so moving and so beautiful, and it resonates with me at so many levels. Uh, you know, and we are at a time, but I can't not share this. I remember a friend of mine. Uh, her name is Cindy Suarez. You might have met her. She's wrote a book called The Power Manual. But she many years ago gave me a set of metaphysical books, and I would never have read any of that stuff unless it was her giving it to me, because I kind of respected her intellectually. She's another Puerto Rican woman, a black woman from here, from Boston, and I could just trust her thought enough to read these books. And they were collectively known as the Seth books, and in it, there were channel books. I mean, wild stuff, and they would go to these places in dreams and through other forms of travel where they would meet these speakers, and the speakers would transmit wisdom through sound, right? And not necessarily through words, but through resonance and vibration. And I have been reading those books when I kind of stumbled my way into my yogic practice, which included a lot of chanting, and I had a series of experiences that way that made me really get, the power of resonance as medicine. So I just think it's a total blessing that's how you've concluded. I appreciate you so much, and thank you for saying
Oh, well,
that.
thank you. And I feel like I want to find these books now as well. So
I'll send you a note about them for
Mhm.
sure. And uh, yeah, so either now or through an email, if there's anything you want to tell us about where to find you, where to find your poetry, where to find your art, where to find your work, anything you want to say, and of course, send anything you want to send for our show notes.
I'm just grateful for this opportunity. It is it I I get to talk about a lot of things in this world. Uh, and this conversation is one that I will treasure and treasure. And I'm excited that it's out. It will be out in the world amongst all sides of theories of change and blah blah blah. Like all these things. And for the way that you hold the space for those of us who get to talk to you, to show up in all of our fullness, in all of our in all of our dignity, and share with you. You create something very special, and I think folks can just Google Sage Crump. You'll find what you find, and that's what you were meant to find.
Beautiful. Perfect. Thank you so much, Sage. I got goosebumps in terms of like the kind of authenticity of our
Yeah.
connection. I am appreciating you so much. I can't wait to put this out. Thank you, and
You
many,
too.
many blessings to you.